the music industry, which is part of what the foundation came out of, a music industry pioneer. Always felt that just like hip hop, which took like 20 years for people to acknowledge and understand as being a main form of music and contribution to culture, I felt like it was going to take a little while for people to understand what was happening within contemporary black art. And the thing that I felt was I was more sad for the people who didn't understand the language because of the oppressive structures and the colonialist framework that was being, pushed through even the academic level of school, because even in school that was an issue just about, where we fit in within the conversation of contemporary art. So for me, it was always about waiting my turn in a way. And I knew that within my group my peer group, Steve Locke included, and Sean Leonardo in the corner over there, I always felt like it was really more about just keep doing your thing. You build, they will come. You just better be ready when they come, because I believe that people would come eventually. I just think that it was really more about patience. And I felt, my job was to, put together interesting shows and to learn from them and do exhibitions with artists who I respected, as well as make my work. And so, yeah.
And building off of that,
Yeah.
because we're thinking about, so we'll get to the question about margin and center and its limitations.
Sure.
But sticking for a bit with what I think can be the potential radicality of kind of staying in a space of not hiding, but there's a certain kind of promise to keeping at the kind of edges of the mainstream. And I think one trend that has emerged, that I've noticed that has emerged, and it's not a new trend, but it's work that is historically rooted, a story that you don't learn in your mainstream history class, that artists choose to engage in and kind of surface in their work. And I've noticed that across all of your works or the artists you work with. So Del, could you talk a little bit about history in your work, maybe in regards to some of the work that we have on view?
Sure.
So which one would you?
We can start with that guy.
Okay, yeah, please.
That image. So this is a piece called Blues Blank Black. I performed it first in 2016 at the 5 Miles Gallery in New York. And this one is tied to multiple histories. So primarily the names and stories of black women who've been killed by the police, either by malfeasance or neglect or incompetence, probably all three of those. So Sandra Bland and Corinne Gaines and Tatiana Jefferson. So in that particular performance that I did at 5 Miles, it was repeating their names over and over and over. And because of the scale of the room and the size of it, my voice would bounce off the wall and then sort of create this kind of echo, right? Then the second layer is the work of Toni Morrison, so The Bluest Eye and Beloved, and thinking about them as black Gothic horror novels, and thinking through what that violence means in the context of haunting or the decisions that mothers make in terms of their children, and thinking so much, again, women who've been killed by the police, either have, their kids are the survivors, right? And so now they don't have moms. So there's that layer. And then the third layer is Central American folklore, and in particular 2 characters, one called La Sucia, who is a woman scorned at the altar. She gets scorned because she hasn't been baptized, which means she's not pure. And so the one thing she does get to hold on to is the wedding dress, which she refuses to take off. And then this character in the black, this is La Llorona, who is a woman who's suspecting her husband of cheating on her. She surveils him, catches him in the act, kills him, kills herself and her kids.
Wow.
So there you go. So both historical, grounded in the present, but then working through time, space, questions. When I first did that piece, I was, the gallery, the 5 Miles Gallery, basically a box, and so I put myself into a corner, but it wasn't so much about being backed into one, it more felt like corners, and I start to think a lot about sort of issue, right, sort of at the crossroads, and these are questions about perception, right, not necessarily that there's a containment, so those kinds of questions. At that time, it was just one character, and then, and I had improvised it. I'm not an improviser. For all of my performances, they're highly calculated. But I had got the space, paid the videographer, like curated the show, and I just forgot to make my own work and figure out what the hell I was gonna do. So I just shoved stuff in the suitcases and the bags and just made that piece up. I had already been thinking about those texts and sort of had memorized them. But then when I performed it again, I thought, wow, what happens if I do things more intentionally? And then how does the space itself, how does a gallery change the work? And because of the shape of that particular gallery space, then I thought, oh, I can bring in these other characters. So then it became sort of like chapters. And then again, kind of moving between time and space and moment. So for me, again, those are the kinds of questions about what margin could look like in terms of maybe the names of these Black women whose names are sometimes unfamiliar to us, but then also to buy these moments throughout the performance where I am centering things, but then also to taking a pause in the performance where most recently I performed it at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Mass. Apparently I am the first visual artist to present a performance artwork in that institution. I just confirmed that a couple of days ago because I couldn't wrap my mind around that. I just didn't know what to do with that. But again, thinking about that history, and so there's a moment in that last performance where I just lay down on the ground for several seconds or minutes or moments, and afterward, some of the scholars that saw that piece were like, the fact that you took that time to pause and let that kind of sit in the air about what happens next, and to a point where you make it uncomfortable for the viewer, but also for me. But these questions too about the piece as a eulogy, right? And so those moments of solemnity that we need. So in those instances, I'm moving from corner to center to the wall to the floor to the. So again, I'm thinking more about like fluidity.
Yeah. Thank you. And so one thing that stood out about that, well, many things, but this turned toward legacy of slavery as a huge aspect of contemporary Black practice.
Right, absolutely.
Pat, and I'm wondering if you could then take us to the recent Dred Scott.
Yeah, or I can also talk about Steve, who's sitting here in the audience too. I don't have a picture of his project because it hasn't happened yet. So yes, most recently, I will say, Dred Scott, it was like 3 weeks ago, I think, he finally completed his Slave Rebellion reenactment, and he used Kickstarter to fund a portion of actually creating the historical costumes for the project, but it was the largest slave rebellion march in Louisiana that historically has ever happened, and he fully reenacted, I think it was 26 miles long, the walk.
That is a marathon, literally
yes,
a marathon.
it is.
It's 26.2.
And he fully restaged this and included the community in New Orleans to come, well, all over Louisiana to come and be a part of it instead of it simply being like art people in it. So he was engaging with a different audience. I also think with like Steve is a really good example, and I just would be remiss since he's sitting in the room not to talk about him. But we ran a project this summer for his slave auction block memorial in Boston, and something that Steve had been working on for over a year when he was the artist in residence for the city of Boston. And it was to put a monument, a very low to the ground, very, very much in line with Boston, monument in Faneuil Hall, which was named after a famous trader who primarily traded slaves. And it was an amazing project. He needed to raise the initial funds for it. It did get caught in politics. So it got caught in a very current conversation that we're having right now about whether we should be changing the name of a space because it's named after somebody, or whether we should be talking about what happened there, thinking about it so that we never do it again. And unfortunately, Steve got caught in the crosshairs of a political conversation between a group that really didn't like the mayor of Boston and thought that Steve was basically a pawn in the mayor's machine, which he was not. And he consistently had tried to reach out to the community to bring in the community for this. His project on Kickstarter, actually, it was funded in 7 days. And with 7 days left in the 30 days of the project, he found out that the Boston branch of the NAACP, which had been heavily lobbied by a community activist, came out against the project. And I mean, that's heartbreaking, right? I remember, Steve, you called me and you asked, I think I have to cancel the project on Kickstarter. And I said, I don't think you do. Because I think that if you're transparent and you talk to the people who have supported this project and you clearly communicate the history of your relationship, specifically with the Boston branch of the NAACP, that you're going to actually elucidate a lot for people in this process and perhaps get more people to support the project. Thank God I was right. Steve gave one of the most honest updates on a project to a community that I've ever seen and continued to raise, I think it was like $3,000 more after that point. And because this project can happen anywhere along the eastern seaboard, unfortunately. It is a part of our American history, it's a part of our identity as a country, and we need to be having this important dialogue. So he's still looking for places. He's still in dialogue with several cities, but it is something that needs to happen. And I think for me, what we didn't realize in this is that Steve also became a part of a project, not a project, but a thrust for my work for the next few years, which is trying to work with artists to talk about the research and development phase of a project, because we don't have any institutional or governmental funding for that anymore, and there's only really one foundation that funds that at this point. So how do we find ways to get people involved in the early stage of an artist project, walk them through that creative process, which doesn't go like A, B, C, D, it goes like A, B, G, Z,
Yes.
back to C, like
Yeah.
things don't follow a normal process at all.
There you go.
So how do we find ways to like engage with a bigger community so they can understand the artistic process, that it's not this like market-driven, make the thing, it has to be exactly what you proposed it to be, and this is exactly how it works. We need to have more openness for our creativity so that we can have a larger audience in on it.
Thank you, and I'm wondering, speaking of artist process and audience, a larger audience, I'm wondering, Derek, if you could talk about your Patrick Kelly exhibition at, this actually wasn't a,
It was with the Schomburg City Museum.
it was at, yeah,
It was
I don't know
shown
why.
at the, can't remember the library now.
It was not County Cullen Library.
Yeah, County Cullen
Okay,
Library,
yes.
yeah, it was held at the public library because it was just more accessible for people versus the Schomburg, which is like, a research library.
Right.
It's a lot more effort to come in and to look around. Most of my work really relies on lived experience and also histories that are, again, very obvious to me, and I think my particular cultural group, and things that I consider mainstream, and kind of thinking about that as source of inspiration and information to make work. And this particular body of work was based on research, archive research at the Schomburg, through Studio Museum in Harlem for a solo exhibition where I kind of looked through Patrick Kelly archive. And Patrick Kelly was an African-American designer who died in 1990. And actually, I think he was pretty much the pioneer for a lot of pop culture fashion, a big influence to a lot of younger designers even today, who don't even know who he is, but I think he kind of jump-started a lot of things about embellishment on objects and using very familiar objects to apply onto very basic cuts, but also a lot of social commentary that kind of he used a lot with his clothing, but I thought of him as being more like an artist, a conceptual artist with soft sculpture than just a fashion designer. So I was interested in him to learn more, and when I learned his archive was at Schomburg, I spent a significant time looking through his drawings and the letters that people wrote to him and he wrote to them, and I came across a letter from, what's the poet? Maya Angelou. She wrote a letter to a publishing company asking to write a book on Patrick Kelly. And the letter was like a plea to support him, and that she felt that it was the perfect timing for him to have a book on what he's done, his contribution to culture. And the book was called Patrick Kelly, The Journey, which was the proposed title. So I used that title as a title for the show. And so the show was called Patrick Kelly, The Journey, and I used a lot of the color patterns and images that were used for his rough drawings for fashion as a basis for my images and works that I made that also referenced his drawings and his aesthetic, and also including clothing patterns that I collected of Patrick's from online, Vogue, different Butterick. He did a lot of different clothing patterns for a lot of different companies, and so I used a lot of those and I incorporated them into the collages. And I think overall my whole intention for art making is to kind of uncover what I think is very clear and what is obvious to me, to the world. And I think there's a lot of nuances within Black culture that even Black people don't know about, because I think that the way society, even institutional society, is structured, that we know more about what happened to us than what we've contributed to the world. And I think for me as an artist, I spent way more time learning these things. I think kids know about slavery from elementary school, but they don't know who Patrick Kelly is. They don't know who a lot of people have contributed things to contemporary culture internationally. I mean, they don't know the extent of Blackness internationally and the things that happen. And so for me, in grad school, I started to become really interested in these lived experiences that kind of go beyond the colonial framework, which for me, I felt in grad school that we all were kind of living under that, and that there were a lot of privileges from some people in my group that didn't have to deal with those issues in their work. And I realized that Black body was already political, and the Black subject matter was already political. So the thing for me was how to engage in a way that is based on the consistency of how I live on a daily basis throughout the structure of oppression and the things that I'm very engaged in on a daily basis socially, social-politically, I am. But I felt like in my studio, I wanted to be, in my life as an artist, I wanted to be constantly learning about certain cultural contributions that happened in society that I just thought, young people need to know about, like Hidden Figures. Like, that's something that I felt you should know that elementary school. Those things that we have to have a movie about to know about. And to me, I felt this as an artist, that's kind of really sad that, that's not a norm for us. So for me as an artist, I became really interested in making those things, the normal things, part of mainstream culture and visual culture.
Yeah, and so I guess that can bring us to our question of margins and centers and complicating that dichotomy or dynamic or whatever we want to call it. Because, we're in Miami, obviously we're very close to the Caribbean, and there's a huge Caribbean influence here, and I think, as you mentioned, Derek, one of the things that, one of the realities of life is that we live in an international, global, increasingly syncretic, if we allow it to be, certain art ecosystem.
Right.
And to me, that seems like the future of, increasingly the future of art world production. I'm thinking of the Havana Biennale that was recently inaugurated. Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts, the three of your thoughts on, and it can be as specific or general as you want it, about the place of the international in your practices, who you're looking towards, what figures you're interested in surfacing. Obviously, it's at the root of your practice, Del.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say my most major influences are Magda Campos Pons. She's an Afro-Cuban artist who was teaching at the SMFA, the School of Museum of Fine Arts, which is now at Tufts University. So I went to the SMFA specifically to study with Magda. I had been following her work forever. When I was growing up as a kid, there was no Afro-Cuban or Afro-Honduran. You were just Honduran or Cuban. My parents were pretty clear about the fact that we were Black, but again, living between both ethnicity and race were questions that I knew that working with Magda could help me figure out. And so that has translated in a bunch of different ways in terms of, and also to the way that she works, the fact that she works between both performance and photography and installation and all these different things. So I've modeled a lot of my practice on just watching Magda work and performing with her. The second person I would say hugely important, probably two other folks as well. So Carrie Mae Weems, obviously, Deborah Willis. Deb wrote my recommendations for the museum school. So I had access to her because I'm at the Hutchins Center at Harvard. And then Marilyn Arsom, who is a time-based experimental performance artist in Boston, who does durational pieces looking at, let's say, a tulip opening up, right? And to the point where, I think the tulip started to talk to her. So it's weird. So this is there's weird things that happen in performance. Marilyn is really fixated on stillness and time and death and how do you manipulate time, right? And how those things sort of intercede in social forces and perception. So that was something that I don't think I could have learned on my own, partly because my undergrad is in journalism and I thought I was going to the museum school to go make photographs. And I took a seminar with Marilyn, the body as material. And as Derek was saying, the Black body is already political. And so to me, it was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. What I was trying to do in photography, I was like, I can do this way. So performance is absolutely at the root of it. But then again, the kind of influences around the Caribbean. So there's work that I had most recently in a solo show at Salem State University in Massachusetts, which is on the North Shore, Salem witch trials, like that kind of history. But there's one piece, it's called Leviathan, the Blue Knight, AKA the Beast. And it's based on, initially the figure or kind of cipher I was looking at is El Pulpo, which is translated as the octopus. United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita, they had plantations all throughout the Caribbean in the wake of the collapse of slavery. And so some of my family members worked on these plantations. And so I kept thinking about entanglements, the entanglements of this octopus that you cut off one sort of limb and then another one grows. And that absolutely happens certainly with slavery, after slavery collapsing in other plantation economies and certainly in Haiti. The plantation owners just moved that economy over to Cuba, right? And so then at some point, things maybe fail there and then move it to New Orleans, right? So again, all those kinds of questions. So that particular mixed media piece is 10 by 15, and it's tons and tons and tons of crinkled paper looking like a kind of exploding kind of cyclone thing. So certainly hurricanes are really part of Caribbean history, but again, kind of referencing El Bupo, the octopus. So yeah, again, these questions about the Caribbean and its insistence, and also learning just through 23andMe that I've got all these other islands, both Jamaica and St. Vincent, and so realizing like, oh, wait a minute, the story is even bigger than I thought it was. So yeah, the Caribbean for me, it's kind of endlessly interesting. And then presenting work at the Havana Biennial in Matanzas, where Magda created her project called Intermittent Rivers. I read an essay on the archipelago as a kind of archetype, and then started to use shapes of islands and such to create a mixed media piece on the wall. I wasn't sure how
I wish we could have an image of that, sorry.
I know, I meant to bring those like this morning. I was like, why did you not send up more images? Anyway, but needless to say, in that context, whether or not the person was familiar with my work at all, they were invested in these shapes that were happening and that I was developing. So I created like a whole new body of work in 6 days. I don't recommend that. Partly because we just could not get around the embargo issues and getting the artwork to and from Cuba. And so Magda was like, oh, it's gonna be great. You're gonna be inspired. It's gonna be fabulous, Del. You just put all your stuff in a suitcase, you're gonna be great. And I'm just like, she is tripping.
Yeah, well, you made it work.
I made it work by hook or by crook. But in that particular instance, yeah, the constraint actually forced me to make a different set of, forced me to pose a different set of questions and answers.
Thank you. Patton, could you speak, you obviously know about logistics and art. Could you speak about Kickstarter's relationship to the globe
Yes.
and
Definitely.
yeah.
Well, I should say we can only run projects in certain countries.
Right.
So we are limited as an organization by where we're actually literally allowed to process credit cards. So talk to Stripe. But I do travel a fair amount. I actually, despite having an American accent, I was born in America, but I grew up in London. So I didn't grow up in the United States, and that was like where most of my formative time was in the UK. And I go to Europe quite a bit, and it's been interesting to watch. Well, it's been interesting from the perspective of Kickstarter of trying to support artists or institutions running projects there, because they've had such strong governmental funding of the arts for so long. It's hard to convince somebody to run a Kickstarter there. Just even if their idea is amazing, there are fewer projects there. Unfortunately, what we know is that governmental funding structures in Europe are drastically changing, and everyone's being told to look to the US philanthropic model, which is, for lack of a better word, fucked up. We should have a government that funds art, because then we wouldn't have half the problems that we have right now. So it's starting to shift, but then you're both trying to convince an artist or an institution to run a project, let's say in France, but you're also then trying to figure out who's actually going to support this thing, because people are used to just the government taking care and offering these things to them culturally. But I will also say, if we're thinking about like race and identity, there were 2 shows I saw in Paris this year that both of which, one started in New York, Le Modèle Noir, started at Columbia, and then it went to the Musée d'Orsay, and thinking about what you were talking about as well, with looking at our, the things that already existed, things that were normal. There was a history of the black body in painting that just sort of, we never really learned. I didn't learn it in art history, that wasn't part of my formative education. And then also there's a show, and thankfully there's actually a piece in Art Basel in the Meridian section by Theaster Gates called The Dance of Malaga. And he had a show at Palais de Tokyo that was called Amalgam, which is a play on Malaga, but it's about this island off of the coast of Maine that was where interracial couples lived, and that white people got so upset that they went and actually killed everybody on the island. And you should see this video piece because it's incredibly moving and beautiful. But that show for me also illuminated so much. So we're seeing, and France has a very complicated history, obviously, with colonialism. But we're seeing exhibitions and things starting to address these issues. Even in London, I was just there last week, and there's now advertisements about how we engage with black people, in the tube. And I'm like, I didn't know that was really I actually, growing up there, that never seemed like an issue. I was like, we have issues with Islam and other things here, but that never seemed to be as much of a problem. But now it seems to be these are conversations that are spanning much more widely, and how we take art into that process as well, and also build community where they believe that they need to be speaking with an artist, investing with an artist, working with an artist on this too. So I hope that it's easier for me to be able to work with artists and organizations in Europe and other places in the future, but primarily most of our work is in the United States because of the funding structures here.
Yes, and one thing you said, which I want to pick up on, that what's happening in the tube and Europe trying to work out its relationship to race. The US is obviously still doing the same, and I wonder if, Derek, you could talk about what's a hot topic right now because of that New York Times article about the rise of black art, but it's true that within these conversations about center and margin, specifically in the US, black art plays a huge role within those discussions. And I'm just, this is there's no agenda behind it. I'm curious about, even with you, Pat, and the examples that you provided, Kickstarter does seem to be supporting the work of black artists in a particular way. And I'm getting... Derek, even your thoughts as a curator who's seen and participated in, you as well, Del, as your curatorial and artistic career.
What people kind of fail to understand or at least acknowledge is that most of the black artists who we know now to be masters, again, like Ed Clark and Frank Bowling, the reason why the work is around is because black collectors actually have been collecting that work. Maybe not on the market value of what their work should be, but the reason why we even know who Howardine Pindell and a lot of people that we're learning about is because before they were considered mainstream, they were being supported by Black collectors. And those Black collectors were responsible for paying their rent, sometimes giving them money to support their families, a lot of different things like that. And that's a narrative that we should be more exposed to, instead of I guess the reverse narrative is that most of the collectors are not Black. And they're speaking more on the market value of collecting versus the support system in which we actually exist in, up until the point, because we have been responsible for, although in the generations beforehand have been responsible for, preserving the work. A lot of the works that even go to market now of those artists are being resold by older Black people who've kept that work for years, since the 60s and 70s. And they're cashing in because they should be cashing in, because a lot of those collectors have been buying multiple pieces from one or two artists. And I think that's really interesting, because the conversations that have, been, pushed out about collecting Black art, which was a New York Times article, was not very thorough in talking about collecting versus supporting, and thinking about a relationship to the market, because that's the most important conversation we should be having, not just focusing on what is considered mainstream to the majority, and more talking about the legacy of how these works even have been around.
And preserved.
Yeah, and these artists have been making work consistently since the 50s and 60s,
Right.
and and having very little support. And the people who have supported them should be acknowledged as well, because I think that's is a disservice to the education of the new generation of Black collectors and Black supporters. That you might support someone, but you may not get acknowledged for being supportive because you aren't considered a mainstream collector.
Right.
And I think that's where we are going wrong with even taking the bait. When and that's what I think is so great about just going to the library and doing research and going to the archive and learning more. A lot of things that you will learn will not be on Google. You have to go somewhere.
Right.
And sit somewhere.
You gotta do some work.
Yeah, you have to put those white gloves on and go into
Yes.
the library and
Yeah.
read,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of narratives that are not going to be, the tragic narratives are way more interesting than the supportive narratives, which may be boring, but I think those people should be privileged to have those too, because they should be able to compare the things that we've gone through and the things that we've contributed to, and I think that's where we're falling short in the balance of the story.
Right.
Story, yeah.
Del, do you?
Yeah, I do. So I do remember reading that article by Roberta Smith.
Yeah, you don't have to reference the article in particular. I mean, that is, I think that's an actually
read it.
widely
No, you
shared
probably all
opinion.
read it, and,
Okay.
and you probably maybe need to read it a couple of times. I had to, because I couldn't figure out why it bothered me. I mean, what Derek just talked about, that articulates, I think, the thing that was problematic for me. But it also made me think a lot about these networks of Black collectors, but also Black scholars, Black elementary school teachers, all those folks, who, again, have been supporting Black artists for a very long time. And I think a lot, too, about the Black Portraitures series of conferences that has been spearheaded by Deborah Willis. So this year it was at NYU, last year it was at Harvard. I read a lot of applications. Anyway, what I always think about in those contexts is the early 2000s, when folks like Skip and Thelma and Mary Schmidt Campbell and Carrie James Marshall, they huddled. Kelly Jones, exactly. They huddled and had like a colloquium. And initially it was kind of like a closed door thing, but they were trying to figure out, like, what is the next step? Like, if we had our druthers and we could teach Black art within our respective institutions, what would that look like? And which artists will we be focusing on in order to do that? And so that in and of itself, and certainly Kara's work had exploded, and Skip ends up being one of the folks defending her work, right? So again, it's like, the black art mafia, that is real. That is real, and it's important. And again, these are folks who've been working on the ground for a very long time, trying to get us to this moment, right? So yeah, those folks have been invaluable for me, having access to them, working on conferences and lecture series, and hearing their stories about how they are also multi-hyphenates. So that, for me, was a model that I could then put into practice and then figure out for myself. But again, those spaces are there, they're generative, and they're supportive, and they're transparent. And yeah, people need to know these stories, and to also be, again, thinking about the primary sources that are out there in terms of scholars interviewing these artists, right, and creating oral history projects.
It's important for that knowledge to be that there are black collectors and that have been black collectors. That information needs to be more accessible, because that is what's going to give the fire and the direction for the next generation of young black entrepreneurs to feel that it's possible and that it's worth doing, because for them to know that, there were collectors supporting artists that they see in museums now at a very early age is going to show these young artists that maybe the artist that you like right now, if you like someone, you should just get their work. And maybe in the future it might be something that could be beneficial for you financially, even if you like it. It still may be valuable for you. And I think that just knowing that art is significant and, as a significant contribution to your life is enough for younger people to know, but they have to see examples of it. And, and for a lot of younger artists, millennials and even younger, they don't have privilege to the information that I have as another generation to be around a lot of these artists, like, the older generation. So they don't have the history, and and people look at media to give them the truth or the idea of the truth. But again, we really have to also promote the idea of looking for information and seeking things that are, because you'll just be surprised to learn so much history that's here, that's happened within American culture, black culture, that that is very supportive of art and artists, and has always been, but it's just not put out there. It's just not put out there.
Patton, did you have any thoughts on the?
Well, in terms of the reason that we tend to primarily work with more diverse artists is because funding structures don't typically give funds to more diverse artists. And so we become sort of this alternative mechanism. But even to what you're saying, I mean, you were in a show at a gallery that I used to be the director of. The show's called Bigger Than Shadows, and it was in 2011 at a gallery called Dodge Gallery.
Oh yeah.
And like it was you, Noah Davis, Kambuya Olujimi, Ebony G. Patterson, all these artists that like people kind of knew, but didn't really like the way that they like. I mean, Ebony had the most amazing year last year, right? So I can tell you, I mean, I can't say who we sold art to, but we primarily sold the art to black collectors. I mean, you were seeing a community show up and continue to support itself, and like that's exactly what you're talking about. We're just in a different generation of doing that too. And it needs to be, the problem with the art market is that it's so not transparent. That it's harder to get that information, even as we're existing now, out there, unless the collectors are purporting to share that themselves.
Because mostly, when they're reporting about who's collecting, it's usually people who have a reputation to being popular for collecting. And there are people who collect who are not looking for prestige within mainstream publication to collect art. And the people who are reporting should do more homework to find out actually, how has this artist been able to maintain their practice for 30 or 40 years? Who has been buying this work? Because someone's been buying it. Someone has been supporting this person in some ways, and you just have to find out who that person is, and it may not be something you can just Google, or you just get someone to tell you. You might have to go do the homework.
But it's also I mean, I think about it from Kickstarter, like it's some part of it is sort of unfair that it's putting the burden also, like from what we do, back on the artist to go back to the community. Like I use Hank Willis Thomas as a great example of this. He did like a Kickstarter project in like 2013, another one in 2016, and he applied for the Guggenheim Fellowship 9 times before he got it. So like we had to put the burden back on the artist to be able to do that. But if he was maybe a white man, he probably might not. He probably could have gotten the Guggenheim Fellowship before those 9 times. So unfortunately, like while we're trying to get institutions to become more cognizant of the behaviors that they have, we have to tap into these alternative models. And I also would say like it's the same for figuring out ethical funding structures at museums too, like trying to pull back from the biggest voice in the room. So.
Thank you all. I actually want to make one note before do we have time for a couple of questions? Okay, I did want to quickly say, because we ended on this note of the kind of the future of Black art, and you know, I'm not plugging the Pratt booth, but I do want to say, because
Jane's like, yes.
Oh, plug it.
it wasn't intentional, but I think one of the great yields of the present is it's ever more clear about the diversity of Black art and all of its facets. And what was interesting to me about working on this is that, you know, William T. Williams, who is an abstract exclusively, like there's no figuration to be found, at least that he would ever want to share, artist, it foregrounds it as a Black artist. Jason Stopa, again, a Black artist who also works in a primarily, actually exclusively abstract mode, and then Devin Johnson, who arrived, who is working at the intersections of figuration and abstraction, and Alana Fields, who's also bringing in graphic design, figuration, all of these things, color blocking, and I think that that's also something that is really exciting to see, the openness to recognize that Black artists make whatever they want and are excellent in all aspects of painting, printmaking, et cetera, performance increasingly. And with that, I think we can maybe 1 or 2 questions, because I think we're over time. And thank you 3 for this conversation.
Nobody has a question? Really?
Hello, good morning. Thank you for sharing this morning. You know, as I was listening, I was really listening for some thinking around how folks are shifting things, and I think I've heard some things, particularly this idea of the Black collector versus the supporter as a strategy, right, of how we can shift things. I've been thinking a lot about success, particularly for those artists and culture makers who are at the margin, and how we measure success. And I think a lot of success, particularly in you all's world, is defined by the institution and where you get displayed. And I'm curious, and this is particularly for you, Derek, when as you think about success, particularly around Black art, you talked about seeing all of those folks when you were younger and having this sense of patience. Now, once you've gotten to the place where you are successful and you do have a voice and you can like make demands, is there conversation, have you thought about how you recenter that success in a Black institution or alongside places that once your work is shown, it kind of helps to build some systemic and structural infrastructure for those places, so that we're actually shifting we're shifting the avenue in which, which success is driven, but also shifting it to places that are actually providing space for artists at the margin. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
My question is making sense.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, and so I've been thinking about this a lot about, I work in the theater world, and so I'm thinking about the Black playwright that gets to get on Broadway, and now any show that they produce or write can just really transform a theater, but usually those commissions still are put into predominantly white institutions and or institutions that have the leverage and resources to be able to support them. But what does it mean to redirect those works into institutions that don't have that support but can help build and grow it?
Well, I think it has to do with priorities for the most part, and there's some artists who desire to be more in a mainstream, more acceptable culture of art, exhibition space. And there's artists who make what they make, and they end up in many different places. And when I make work, I never think about it being in a museum or a gallery or anything like that. I always think about the idea of producing the work, or at least having the idea come to fruition as a show or as a thing. I never really think about the space first. I like to think about the idea and producing. And I think a lot of that came from being around the older generation and seeing them be so productive without having a exhibition or anything planned. And I always thought that that's what you do as an artist. You just make art, and you just and you challenge yourself, and you do these things that will push you. And what I also took away from being around these artists from a previous generation is now that I'm considered to be somewhat of a successful artist, whatever, but I still laugh about many occasions. I'm always directing people to look at other people. Mm-hmm. That's what I love to do. It's my favorite thing to do, is direct people to look at other artists and younger artists. I think that's the biggest privilege and the biggest part of achievement and success to be an artist, is to be able to point to someone else and to see that person grow, or to see someone connect with that person. Because one thing about art, you can point people into other people's direction, but if they don't like the work, they don't like the work. Right. But at least you're pointing to another direction. Because for me, the ultimate goal, which I felt was not as, it was happening with a lot of the previous generation where they were, had a big community and they would do things a lot together. And I came into art in that experience. So for me, it's trying to maintain that with this generation and next generation. How can we keep that same momentum, excitement, and community going, and everyone also be successful, financially successful in the way that they want to be able to be in their studio and make art, So it feels good when I'm able to do that as an artist, level of success.
Okay, I think this will be the last question. Yeah.
Right here.
I was wondering, do you work a lot of young learners?
Yes.
Like kids in school?
Yeah.
And when they draw something, you just say, you don't tell them it's wrong, do you?
Never.
Never.
No.
I just wanted to know, because when I went to school, I had a right way of drawing a cow and a wrong way, and I never seen a cow before, and my drawings were always not right because I didn't conform to the instructor of my art class.
I never say.
And it always upset me that I never did art work. I never pursued it. I really liked it, but when I was burning the crayons on the steam pipes and then putting them on the paper, she didn't like that. It didn't go over too good.
Keep doing it. Keep doing it.
You don't tell them it's wrong.
No, never. No.
Thank you, and thank you all very much. Yes.